Today we're going to talk about networks and trees. So as a reminder, when we talked about the three different kinds of data, tables, networks, and spatial data, we're now finally going to talk about networks. And so the idea with a network is that we're modeling relationships between things. Often networks are called graphs or Nodelink graphs. And the key thing, as the name suggests, is that there's not just items like we have in a table. There's two kinds of items, and there's nodes in the graph. Those are sort of the most analogous to what we'd normally think of as an item in a table. And then there's this idea that we can explicitly indicate relationships between them, and those are the links. And so with networks, we have a special case. This is pervasive and useful enough that we usually talk about it specifically, and that's trees, or hierarchies, isn't just a synonym for that. And trees are a special case of networks where there is only one parent per node. And so technically what that means is there's no cycles in the graph, or network as we're typically calling them here. And so we'll start by talking about the general case of networks, and then we'll move on to talk about considerations specifically for trees. So what do we use networks for? All kinds of things. Without networks, you wouldn't have Google and web search. You wouldn't have the ability to have computer-drawn maps, which are using networks as a data structure inside. Things like Facebook and Twitter are all expressible as networks of data where you really are thinking about not just nodes, but the links between them. Even the integrated circuits used to actually power this very laptop that I'm using to record this video on, that's using networks. So many, many, many use cases of networks. But what we're thinking about specifically is how do we visualize them? And, even more examples, biological network. There's all kinds of networks in biology. There's things like protein-gene interaction networks. That is, how do genes actually interact with each other, creating proteins and other biomolecular products. There's also the network of how neurons connect with each other in your brain. There's the network of the relationship between you and your parents and your grandparents and aunts and uncles and so on. So ancestry graphs. There's phylogenetic networks. That is the evolutionary networks of how it is that dogs and cats are more closely related to each other through an ancestral species than they are to, say, birds or viruses. So many, many networks in biology, all of them have the same, fundamental idea that there's nodes and links. Here's a truly huge network. It's the metabolic network, expressing how it is that metabolism actually happens in essentially all living beings. As you can see, this is a really big and complex network. So imagine the challenge of how would you make a picture like this automatically? How would you decide how to lay out the nodes and the links to actually make understandable structure? These diagrams have actually been painstakingly manually created, and there's a lot of interesting work in how do we do something like this more automatically. So one thing we have to think about when we think about networks is this idea of topology. And when we say the topological structure of a network, we mean how do you get from one node to the other through the links? You don't get to just sort of, jump through space and worry about which ones happen to be drawn next to each other. You can only move between nodes through this link structure of the network. And so a special case of that then with path following is where we're actually routing along the links. And so we can think of this as hops. We can go from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, but we can't just go directly from 3 to 5. There's no link there. So to get to 5, we'd have to go 3 to 2 and 2 to 5 and so on. So you can think about things like the number of hops, or that is the length of the path from one to the other. So from 3 to 5 is 2 hops. And often we're concerned about things like finding the shortest path between two nodes. So of course, if you go back and remember your algorithms classes, you might have heard of the idea of, shortest path, finding the shortest path through a network with various traversal algorithms. Um, and so often the task we're trying to do in a visualization context is to try to trace paths through graphs to try to understand not just a single shortest path from one to the other. Of course, we could just compute that, but to get an understanding of the overall structure of the graph, where specific paths through it are just going to be examples of, you'll have many questions about a shortest path from, A to B or from Q to Z. Like, it's not just one shortest path you're looking for, you're looking to understand the overall structure. Let me just emphasize that when we're talking about node-link graphs, we really are emphasizing the topology. The topology is what we're given, this topological structure of the graph of nodes and links. What we choose when we're drawing networks, when we're visualizing them, is we choose the geometric layout. Um, that is, the relationship of the nodes and links to each other with the position on the screen. So you'll get different geometric layouts just using different layout algorithms. Those can all be the same topological graph. So we're really distinguishing between topology and geometry. So the topology does not depend on the layout, but the geometry and the proximity relationships between nodes and links absolutely does depend on the layout. So we often, when we're thinking about the topological structure of the network, one way to consider that is node importance metrics, like trying to measure how important is a node in conveying the overall structure of the graph. And one metric that's frequently used is this idea of node degree, of saying that there is some attribute which we can actually just directly compute. Given the topological structure of the graph, we can compute the degree of the node, that is, how many links are connected to it. And it can give us a useful measure of importance. Here's an example of a graph where we've actually, a network, and we've drawn the network where the size of the node depends on the node degree. So see, this is a Les Miserables graph, often used as a testbed in network visualization. And you can see that the Valjean node is large because there's many incoming connections, whereas people like Mother Innocent, who is much smaller because there's only two links coming into that node. So now we can also compute some other derived attributes given the topology of a graph, like what's the average degree across the entire graph? What's the distribution of degrees? That starts getting into one of these questions about what's the distribution of an attribute. So if we consider node degree to be a derivable attribute, then we can think about the distribution of that across all of the nodes in the network. So here's an example where here's one simple graph A where we have 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we think about actually just plotting the degree distribution, of course, we see that, 2 has 3 links, 4 has 2, 3 has 2, and 1 just has a single one. So we see a bell curve here. Notice how if we lay out a bunch of nodes in a circular layout like this, where every single node is degree 2, then of course the degrees distribution is just one big spike for the number 2. And so this actually does tell us some information about the underlying structure of the graph. But all kinds of complexity is hidden from us. So if all we do is look at the degree distribution, that doesn't tell us as much as actually laying out the graph to see more details about what's actually going on. Now, in real-world networks, it's very common that there are power law distributions. That is, a few nodes are really, really high degree, and then it drops off quickly, and there are a lot of nodes that are quite low degree. And so this sort of power law relationship of how many links nodes have, very, very common in real-world graphs. Um, And of course, what gets tricky about that is if you thought about, well, how would you lay out the nodes and the edges of the graph to try to not have too much clutter? Well, it gets tricky because of these high degree nodes where they are going to be connected to a lot. And then that means it's going to be tricky to actually draw these in a comprehensible way. So one slightly more powerful metric on graphs beyond just this idea of the degree of a node is something we can compute called betweenness centrality. And so that is a derived variable that's not just a local measure that we can just count locally how many links are going into a node, but it's a more global metric where we can think how many shortest paths actually pass through a node. We actually alluded to this way back at the beginning of the term when we were talking about that example of derived metrics with the Strahler metric. That's one of many betweenness centrality measures on graph topology. So this is a particularly good measure of how relevant is a node. How often do you have to pass through it as you go from one spot to the other? Um, so it's a slightly more powerful metric than just the node degree. So here's an example where we're comparing just the node degrees to the betweenness centrality. And we see, although there's more of a drop off with the node degrees, we're actually seeing a little bit more interesting structure in terms of the betweenness centrality values. Now, in this case, we actually have a similar situation where the largest, because here we're size coding the node by betweenness centrality, and once again, as Valjean is both the highest degree node and the one with the highest betweenness centrality metric. So the kinds of tasks we do when we're dealing with networks, we can think about whether they're about the attributes that could be associated with either the nodes or the edges, or whether they're about the topology of the graph. So some examples of topology graphs. We've already talked about this idea of pathfinding, finding a path from one node to the other through the hops in the network. So you can only move between nodes along edges. Or you might have nodes like find the topological neighbors, right? Not just the geometric neighbors, but the topological. We saw some examples of this when we were looking at layering a few weeks ago. And so here's an example where the cursor is over one node and we've highlighted all of the one hop neighbors, that is all of the nodes that are directly connected to this one by links. So that's an example of the neighbor finding. We might compare these measures like we just saw, the centrality or the importance. We might want to try to identify some sort of cluster or community structure in the graph. And we'll look at some algorithms that are trying to emphasize this, some idioms for that in a few minutes. But that's not the only thing we can do with graphs. Remember that if we have attributes attached to either the nodes or the links, we could ask some of the same kinds of questions about these attributes that we would ask if it were tabular data and these were just items in a table, right? We could try to find extreme values of attributes or understand the distributions. But of course, what's interesting about networks is that we could have these combination tasks where we have both topology and attributes that we take into account as we do that task. And that's what we wouldn't be thinking about with just plain old table data. So for example, locating, say, one or several either nodes or links with some given property. So for example, if you were first saying, well, find all the adjacent edges of a given node, and then what's the maximum edge weight from that set of adjacent uh, links, well, now suddenly we're having to ask questions about both the topology and the attributes. And so that's something that would be unique to network visualization. So today we're really going to focus on three major families of visual encodings, of layout approaches for graphs. One is node link diagrams, where we actually connect between the nodes with, a line drawing. So these line segments do directly represent the links in a very sort of intuitive and obvious way. That works for both networks and trees. We'll talk about an adjacency matrix where we derive a table and show some things in that. And then we'll talk about the use of enclosure or containment, where we have marks that actually show parent-child relationships. And so that's something that doesn't make so much sense just for networks. It's really specific to trees, since that's the only context where we know that we have this idea that a child has only one parent. Whereas in a general graph, of course, a node could be connected to any number of other nodes. So let's start with the obvious and most pervasive one, which is node link diagrams, where we have nodes. These are typically shown with point marks. They could be shape coded in some way. Often they're circles. They could be squares. You could shape code as an additional channel any way you want, but it's a point mark. And then the links are line marks. Right? So these line marks are not showing a quantitative value like they have been in something like a bar chart. Instead, these line marks are expressing the idea that two nodes are connected to each other by this link. So you draw the mark to connect nodes. You don't draw the mark to show a quantitative value. Often they're straight lines. Sometimes they might be, curved lines like arcs. And what's good about this is it's intuitive, it's familiar. If I were to ask you to draw a simple little network of, like maybe, you know, your family tree and how you're related to your cousin, and I wanted you to sketch that on a napkin with a pen, you'd probably be drawing a node link graph. I would bet money that that is how you would draw that. There's many, many, many variants of this. This is an entire family of approaches. So it's not just that there's only one way to do this. There are many ways to do this, but they all involve this node link style drawing. So here we see a number of examples. Right here, a simple graph. Notice how, we can have different things like laying things out in a circle, laying things out in a grid. We could lay things out according to some other attribute, like in this case, of course, we're obviously using spatial position from something in the underlying data. So all of these are examples of node link diagrams. So what's a good node link diagram? Well, that's an interestingly complicated problem. One way you can think about this is there's a bunch of criteria that you want to either minimize or maximize. So for example, we typically want to minimize edge crossings, right? So if here we have two links and they cross each other, it's kind of distracting. Your eye is really drawn to this X in the middle here, but that's just an artifact, right? Here's a different way to draw that graph. We've put the blue nodes in different positions. And now we don't have that crossing. So, it's possible in this extremely simple example to avoid the edge crossing by just picking different positions for the nodes. So that's the kind of freedom we like to exploit to try to figure out, oh, well, so could we minimize those? We want to minimize things like often the distances between the topological neighbors, like the one-hop neighbors. So things that are topologically connected, you often want to have laid out close to each other. We also want to minimize the total area of the drawing, right? You can imagine a huge drawing in tiny little nodes, and it would be very hard to actually see things, and there'd be lots of wasted white space. So we often want to have this idea that we should minimize the total drawing area. Of course, we don't want everything on top of each other, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. But using area unnecessarily makes everything in the graph smaller and thus more difficult to actually understand. We might want to minimize other things like edge bends. It's complex. Sometimes we want to minimize the disparities in the edge lengths, but sometimes those are actually actively useful to emphasize cluster structure. Now, it's not just about minimizing. Some things we're trying to maximize, right? Like the angular distance between edges. Here's an example where you can see that if that angular distance is too small, it actually gets sort of cluttered and hard to see things, and it's easier to understand the structure if that angle here is big. So that's an example of a property we're often trying to maximize. Or disparities between aspect ratios, right? We probably, in general, it's often better to have something roughly square-like than something very, very long and skinny in either direction, because then that gets, again, hard to see the structure. You're going to have to zoom way in order to see that. And then you'll only be able to see a small little local neighborhood of it at once. in an understandable way. And when you zoom back far enough to see the whole thing, you're not going to be able to see the details. Another criterion people often use for node-link graphs is to try to emphasize the symmetry. If there are similar structures, subgraph structures in the network, it would be great if those actually looked similar in the layout, so you'd have some hope of visually noticing that. Now, what's tricky in network layout is you can't just solve all of these problems computationally because almost all of these criteria are individually in NP, right? They're NP hard. And worse yet, a lot of them directly conflict. So if you try to do the best you can on one, then you might be doing a terrible job on the other. Here's just a few simple examples. Notice how if you want to have the length of all the edges as close to uniform as possible, well, that's actually fighting here on the left with trying to minimize the number of edge crossings. Um, and so, well, that's a tricky situation because notice how, here we have a drawing with no crossings, and here we have a drawing where the edge lengths are much more uniform, but look, we have a crossing in these edges. Or what we might want to do is, really emphasize certain kinds of symmetries, but then maybe we're not going to make very good use of space. And so sometimes we have those two criteria of minimizing the total drawing area versus explicitly showing the symmetries. So this is one reason why network layout is such a sort of interesting area. Is typically you have to use a lot of heuristics to try to decide what's an appropriate drawing. Since you can't do something that's provably optimal in all the cases, you are in a situation where you're typically trying to understand what task the user is trying to do and come up with a layout that's actually appropriate for their task to solve this problem pragmatically. So it's very common to formulate network layout as an optimization problem. And so what you can do is have all these criteria of minimizing this and minimizing that and maximizing this as a cost function. And so you can think about every time you do something undesirable, there's some cost to it. And so you can have some, function where you're thinking of, well, maybe you've got some weights and you have a certain penalty for crossings and a certain penalty for using too much drawing space. And so you think of this weighted cost function as something that you're trying to minimize. And then there's a whole suite of techniques out of optimization to try to find the minimum cost layout. Sometimes these are called energy-based models. They often, sometimes it's called force-directed placement, spring embedders. And so a lot of these are trying to have analogies to physical systems. So one of the most common forms out there, force-directed placement, is a physics model where you really think of this very concrete physical analogy. You think of links like springs that are actually trying to pull things together. Like literally, if you took a spring and connected things, but the nodes are trying to repel each other. So think of the nodes like little magnets that have repelling forces. But of course, every time they're connected by a spring, they're getting drawn together. So the magnets are pushing away from each other, but the springs are drawing them together. And so you really do think of this graph layout as just trying to simulate the physics of how these, springs and magnets would interact. Um, and so what's appealing about this for so many people, and this has been sort of invented and reinvented many, many times, is it's really easy to think about a basic algorithm for this, right? You could just put things in random locations and then try to calculate forces and go through and say, well, all the nodes are repelling each other, but you've got these attraction forces. You do one round to compute it. And then you move each vertex according to these forces that were on it. And you iteratively do this, many, many times until you start to see this layout start to converge. If you're lucky, it might converge. It doesn't necessarily have to converge. Um, so let's just look at an example of this. And this is a D3 block that is showing a basic force-directed placement. And come on, notebook, you can do it. Right, actually, wait, this is not the droid I'm looking for. I did not want the tidy tree. I wanted, uh, that is the wrong link. Um, yeah, I wanted the force-directed placement. My mistake for getting my links added up there. So, right, here is the thing we were looking for. Notice how this graph is sort of, you could see things sort of starting to push each other apart, and then it roughly converged. It's actually quite easy in these kinds of algorithms to allow users to interactively just move one of the nodes around, and then notice how everything else is sort of following it because of these spring forces. And well, what can we see here? We could certainly see some kinds of clusters, right? That's clearly a strongly connected cluster. In here, we can see here is a bridge that actually this hub connects um, you know this little subgraph to the rest. That's the only way that these nodes can connect up. Here's another one of these near bridge nodes here. So we're able to really understand a fair amount about this topological structure of this graph, and we're able to notice which nodes are high degree, and it falls out of this layout. Now, I want you to notice something here. The actual, physical position, I'm just dragging these around at will. Um, it's not directly encoding any particular quantitative variable. So this is very, very different from something like a scatter plot. You might be tempted to think, oh, I see a bunch of, point marks. Is this just a scatter plot? But it's not, because the position, the horizontal and the vertical position, are not directly telling you anything. This is one of the interesting challenges of these kinds of layouts is, we've spent a long time talking about how crucial spatial position is because we have such a ability to accurately perceive it. But we're not actually using spatial position to understand any attribute in particular here. We're just using it to try to figure out how to lay out these nodes and links in a way to just minimize things like edge crossings. So it's a very different regime than we were seeing before. So what's good about force-directed placement? Well, it actually does quite a nice job if the graph is very, very small and if it's quite sparse. That is, if there's relatively few links compared to the number of nodes, not too many more nodes than links. And it's quite good at trying to keep all of the edge lengths fairly uniform. And we can usually see some amount of cluster structure. Well, what's imperfect about this? For one thing, the part where we lay things out randomly at the beginning, well, that's non-deterministic. You could lay out a node link graph 2 different times, using exactly the same algorithm, but actually see different layouts. Another way it's really different from something like a scatter plot where, we know the position of each node is dictated by the attribute values. Another issue is it's actually quite expensive computationally. If we do something naive, it's an n-cubed algorithm. So if there's n nodes, it's n-cubed because on every pass we go through and do computations that, for all pairs of things. And then in general, we often have to do about n rounds of layout if we have n nodes in the graph. So in general, a straight up naive force-directed placement algorithm is not going to scale very well past around 1,000 nodes, if that even. So we're not going to be able to just use simple force-directed placement to lay out large graphs of things like 10,000 or 100,000 nodes. Another problem is that part where it sort of bounces around and converges. Although people often really are engaged with that and they like watching that, it can be quite distracting. And because it's sort of it's getting your attention without necessarily telling you something about the underlying structure of the graph itself. So let's play around a little bit more with some force direct placement just to get some sense of what's actually going on. So this is a nice little test bed that Steve Harrose made. where we can play around with things like, what's the repelling strength of the nodes? And, if it's too strong, of course, they're all on top of each other, and so that's our attraction and repelling strength. We can have some minimum distances, some maximum distances, not too much here. And then what about the part of, avoiding overlaps between the nodes? How much of a radius? Wow, okay, we get overachieved there. This is just actually showing the size of the points. Notice how now with the nodes much larger, of course, these are actually starting to overlap each other, but then the algorithm goes ahead and tries to get them to actually not be on top of each other because there's a penalty for node-node overlaps here. And then we can do things like have, something like a gravitational force that's going in a particular direction. Actually, let me get that node radius back down to something a little more reasonable. So let's, actually turn on, the force that's going in this direction or a force that's going in that direction. So we can certainly play around with a lot of these forces. And the main point that I want you to see from this really is acting like a simulation. And so, and we are able to change these forces and then control to a certain extent what happens with the layout. All right. So let's go through and analyze this, right? We've just talked a lot about the properties of this kind of placement. Let's go back to our idea that we're always doing analysis and analyze force-directed placement as a visual encoding idiom. So, well, what have we got? Well, we've got point marks for the nodes. The links are connection marks, explicitly indicating connections between these. And as I said, spatial position does not directly encode any particular meaning at all. It's simply used to resolve this question of how can we minimize things like the number of crossings. So what's really tricky about Nodelink graph layouts is sometimes things are next to each other and it means something, right? It actually means something that all these purple nodes are next to each other because they're strongly connected topologically. But on the other hand, we saw that I could just start, moving things around. What does it mean that, this green node is, here as opposed to say maybe over there, right? It could be close to this purple node or it could be close to some other node. The entire graph could be, say, rotated so that this one was closer to the top. So both the absolute location and even the relative location of these nodes does not directly mean something. So that's this really tricky situation. It's also worth noticing that our eye is drawn to some of these really long links, but in fact, if there are strong topological connections, that's going to tend to make the links smaller. So there's sort of an inverse relationship between the saliency of these large links and actually, the meaning that these short links actually mean things are strongly connected to each other. So that's another tricky trade-off. So the tasks that people are typically doing, well, as we talked about, it's certainly about exploring the topology. So understanding the topological structure is usually one of the key things people are doing. It can be quite good for path following and locating paths within the graph, and it can be very good for trying to find clusters. So we see that that's a cluster, we see that this is not a cluster, and this is pretty visually obvious. So what about scale? Well, I mentioned on the previous slide that we typically wouldn't try to scale past 1,000 nodes with this kind of a simple approach. But what's also important is the relationship between the number of edges and the number of nodes. Typically, if you've got a graph that's maybe, certain, 2 or 3 times edges versus nodes, sometimes we call these edges, sometimes we call them links. So if you're more than about 4 times the number of nodes with your edge count, you're probably going to get a really, really dense hairball that's going to be quite hard to see. And so Now, by the standards of graph theory, that's actually not that many edges, right? Recall that the maximum number of edges you could have in a graph is n squared. So this is actually a fairly sparse graph that we're looking at compared to something that's really densely connected. So what else can we do? There's all kinds of interesting things to try to scale up to larger or more complex networks. So remember how last time we talked about cluster hierarchies when we were talking about aggregation? Well, and we even talked about the idea that we would do this in the context of networks. Well, let's go back to that idea and actually make sure we fully understand it now that we're talking about network layout. So the idea is that if we are given an original graph, that's the one that we're drawing here on this yellow plane in black nodes, um, that what we would typically do is try to create a cluster hierarchy of what we're going to call meta nodes, right? That is nodes that aren't just the nodes in the original graph, but meta nodes of a higher level structure. Um, and so what we've done here is see how we said, well, there's one cluster A, a second cluster B, a third cluster C. And so we have found this structure of the um, metanodes, and we can think of a metanode as being a parent to all of the children that are the nodes in the original graph. And then, of course, we could keep going. We could say, well, each one of these metanodes, well, maybe they could have a parent. So see how we're using containment in this little diagram where we've got the root level metanode and then metanode A, B, and C. And then, of course, inside of those could be the nodes in the original graph. So the same way that we had this idea of spring forces and so on, well, we could do that with these metanodes. So we could, in some sense, this is like a divide and conquer approach. We've simplified our problem by saying, oh, now we have a much smaller number of nodes in the graph. Let's use these spring forces to get the metanodes into place. And then maybe within, and then we've got a simpler problem where maybe we're less likely to get caught in local minima during our optimization computations if we lay out this higher level hierarchical structure of this cluster hierarchy. So these are what's called multi-level approaches, where we do think about somehow constructing a cluster hierarchy on top of the original base graph. So here's an interesting algorithmic thing to do, which is to take the same visual idiom of force-directed placement, but to try to have a more scalable algorithm to instantiate that idiom. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our original network and we're going to do this derivation to have a cluster hierarchy. So to say, well, there's some cluster of nodes in the original graph. Let's treat that entire cluster together as one of these higher level metanodes. And so we still are laying out these nodes and links. But that hierarchy is not actually directly shown. It's just used to increase the scalability and the speed of the algorithm. So this particular approach, SFDP, is a multi-level approach to force-directed placement. And notice how we're actually able to lay out, in fact, we have so many nodes in this graph here where the point marks are very, very small. We're mainly just looking at the links between them. And we are able to see some structure even in this quite large graph. Now, I also want you to notice that at some point, we will still, if we throw enough nodes at these algorithms, at some point they will really break down when the graph gets dense enough, and we just see these, these are often called hairballs because there's so many edges all on top of each other, you can't really see anything. So even though we can scale up, maybe we can get to say 10,000 nodes, at some point we'll typically hit the limit and just see this sort of really, really cluttered, overlapping, overdrawing hairball structure. Well, what else could we do? I mean, it's certainly force-directed placement is not the only thing that we could do. There are a lot of layouts where we actually have some sort of geometric form that we use to decide where to draw the nodes. So one example would be a circular layout, right? You could lay out all of the nodes in a circle. Or you could just lay out all the nodes in a line and then think about connecting them all with arcs. Um, Now, a thing to notice here when you're doing this is we have some of these same problems of, well, we do want to minimize edge crossings. Um, so, here's an example of before and after pictures where instead of just laying things out in sort of arbitrary order around, in this case, a circle, or in that case, an arc, where things look extremely cluttered, there's a lot of crossings, we can actually try to compute some sort of optimal ordering for these to minimize the number of crossings. And notice how these pictures are much more understandable after that. In this case, it's a so-called barycentric ordering. In this class, we're not going to get deep into the details of that because we're not really covering too much of the algorithmic issues unless you decide you're going to get deep into this for your final projects, but I suspect most of you are not. Um, so, so what we can think of is that the ordering of these nodes, especially like what order would you put them in along a line or around a circle, that would be a derived attribute you could compute where you've computed something that would minimize the edge crossings, and that gives you an ordering for the nodes, in this case, just along that line. There's some other things we could do. An interesting approach called hierarchical edge bundling is an approach to reducing the clutter of overlapping edges. Again, we have this idea of a cluster hierarchy on top of a base graph. Um, and so in this case, the base graph is actually showing the package structure of a software system. And then we're seeing a lot of interconnections. But the picture on the right is much easier to follow than the picture on the left. And what they've done is think about the metaphor just like you would bundle edges together if you're doing any sort of cable management on your desk. My desk, I admit, has terrible cable management right now. So I have all kinds of clutter with my cables. But if I were to grab them all together and bundle them so things coming from one location sort of follow along the same route until they expand out at the end to go to their other location, that's the kind of thing we're doing here. You can almost see something like if you were thinking I use a cable tie here or a rubber band to bring these cables together, that's the kind of visual effect we're getting. And it's then easier to actually do path following. So just to give you some sense of what's going on here, here's a nice progression of this edge bundling algorithm where we go from no bundling at all to gradually increasing the strength of this bundling until we have something where they're almost completely on top of each other and we have a lot of edges that are actually drawn directly on top. So we have something that's very, very concise and compact, but it's harder to see things like how many edges are going in particular directions because we don't get that sense of width. And so we're actually doing, for those of you who've had a computer graphics class, we're actually doing something with splines where we're using control points. If you haven't had a graphics class, don't worry. This is not something I will directly be testing you on. I just want to give you some sense of some of the algorithmic issues involved in network drawing. Even though we're not going to go too deep into them because it's beyond the scope of this class. All right, and so, but just to give you a sense of what these algorithms feel like, here is a D3 implementation of edge bundling. And so, and we can play around, let's just sort of dynamically play with the, strength of this bundling force that we're using to bring these bundles together. And you can get some sense of how, as we increase this force more and more, we're actually seeing these paths where the multiple edges are bundled together, getting more and more skinny as we have more and more overlapping and overdrawing. This is another nice one just because remember that with these interactive kinds of layouts, we don't just have to say we draw the graph and then we're done. It's true that we compute a layout, but then with this kind of interaction, notice how when I move the mouse over a label, I'm able to actually see this idea of the one-hop neighbors being highlighted. And that does allow me to see quite a bit of the structure of this graph. And so even though there is a fair amount of clutter with edge overdrawing, the combination of the static layout and then this dynamic foreground versus background layering that happens as I move the mouse really does allow you to understand a fair amount of that topological structure. So the one-hop highlighting is really, really useful in graph drawing contexts to try to understand more about these complex structures, because we assume we can't draw it clearly enough that you can see all things at the same time. But you're simply by moving the mouse, you're able to essentially query for specific nodes to understand that one-hop neighbor structure. Now, it's also possible to use things not like arcs or circles, but to use some other information source like spatial data. So one fairly common thing is to combine network drawing and geographic drawings. That is, to lay out network nodes according to some sort of spatial data structure. So, an obvious one here is if nodes represent cities, we could actually put the nodes at the geographic lat-long coordinates of cities, as we're seeing in this example down here. So, this is often used when there is some geographic component that's of interest for people to understand. But so you want to have the nodes have these spatial locations, but the edges, you can often make judgments about how to draw those edges. Right, here's an example where we could simply draw edges directly between things. We might be looking at travel routes or things like that. And then we could use that same edge bundling approach to make this less cluttered and more readable, so that you have some hope of seeing more of the structure of the American Midwest here between the two coasts, where that's all just getting overdrawn and the clutter is so much that we're unable to see that internal structure on the left. Okay, so that was one major family of graph drawing, which is a number of different ways to look at node link drawings. So what else is there? Well, there's this idea of an adjacency matrix representation. And so this is where we're deriving data. Here, we're taking a graph and we're looking at it as a node link graph. This is sort of easy to think about. And then we're going to derive an adjacency matrix. So we're deriving a table where we say we take all the nodes in the original graph and we think of them as both, the rows and column of this matrix. And then if there is an edge between two nodes, we're going to fill in that cell, and otherwise we're going to leave that blank. And so you can see here, okay, there is an edge between B and C, and so we fill that in. But there is not an edge between B and, let's see, B and E, right? So B and E, no edge, so that cell is not filled in. Now, if the graph is undirected, then this matrix is going to be, symmetric. The lower triangle half is going to match the upper triangle half. If you had a directed graph where edges actually have direction, then you might have different structures in the two halves of that matrix. So this should look familiar to you, right? This starts to look a lot like the kind of heat maps that we looked at back when we were thinking about tabular data. So we've essentially turned these networks into a table, and we really can think about this as derived data. So let's look at a few examples just to sort of understand this. So, here's an example where we have one node that's connected to every other node. All right, that'll just look like a column here in the adjacency matrix. Or if we have a fully connected set of nodes that are all linked to each other, this is sometimes known as a clique in graph theory. So if we have a fully connected cluster or a clique, then that's going to look like this little, dense region of the adjacency matrix where these are all filled in. Here we can see some other structures, a bipartite graph, or more complex versions of that. So we can go back and forth between these node link versions and these adjacency matrix versions. So they're fully equivalent to each other from a sort of mathematical point of view. But of course, perceptually, notice how these look really, really different. There are definitely there's a lot of ways in which the node-link graphs are easier to understand than these adjacency matrices. Now, just like we saw before with both the arc diagrams and the circular diagrams, ordering really matters because, well, what order should you put the nodes along these rows and these columns? If we just pick an order like, say, alphabetical order by labels, again, these are those same characters from Les Miserables. Well, we see something that sort of just looks like it's hard to tell what it looks like. There's a bunch of cells that are filled in, there's a bunch of cells that are not filled in. It's pretty hard to see the structure. It's sort of like visual popcorn. But if we reorder to try to emphasize these kinds of cluster structures, now we really can start to see the same kinds of structures we could see when we were looking at the force-directed graph. Let's take another look at that one here. So in fact, this color coding, I believe, is matching up. And so right there was the green clique and the tan clique. Let's see if we're right. So the tan, the green. So we're able to see much, much more structure here than we could in the unordered one. So let's actually just jump over and take a look. Again, this has been implemented in D3. And so see how if we reorder things, we're actually seeing the structure more clearly. Remember from back in the week where we talked about animated transitions, this was a good example of how it really helps to have that animated transition to actually follow what's happening with this. If it was just a jump cut, it would be much harder to understand. Let's also take a look by frequency. Right, so that's by node degree. Now, one thing to notice here, this is not just a simple, either there's an edge or there's not an edge, right? We see some very bright green and we see some much less saturated green. So this is an example where our adjacency matrix isn't just a 1 or a 0. We can have an attribute, right? It's like an edge weight. It's the, in this case, it's the number of times they co-occur in the text in things like chapters. But what I want you to notice is that you could either just have the cell is colored in, or the cell is active or not, or we could do something, whether it's luminance coding or saturation coding. We could actually show magnitudes in the adjacency matrix, and so that's often commonly done where we want to show the weights. So what are these good for? Well, it is actually quite easy to do certain kinds of topology tasks that relate to neighborhoods with these adjacency matrices. But they're really, really very bad for the kind of path tracing that's quite straightforward to do with a node link graph, right? Like here we can see we go from A to E to C to B. That's easy to trace here. If I just gave you this adjacency matrix view and I asked you to, sort of follow paths, it's not obvious at all how to do that. That's actually a much more demanding task. But, quickly saying, well, which nodes are, what are the one-hop neighbors of B? In the graph, we might have to say, oh, I have to follow this. Let's see, there's D, and there's C. That becomes, these are actually not identical graphs here. But saying, B is connected to A, to C, and to D in a different graph, that's something you can just read off directly from, traversing a row or a column. So there is some kinds of structures that you can see in both, right? You can see cliques, these or near cliques, these fully connected things if you've reordered your matrix. So you can see clusters, but let's now think about this again from a idiom analysis point of view. So what have we done? We have taken network data and we have transformed it because we have derived a table. where we just take the node list and we consider those to be categorical. And then we have this quantitative attribute, which is there a edge between the nodes? And in fact, it can even, instead of just being 1 or 0, can be it can be a weighted edge if we want to have that. And so here are a couple examples of, again, we have a very simple visual encoding and then a much more complex one. And we can see side by side these adjacency matrix views versus the Nodelink views. The visual encoding is just that we draw these as a matrix. The cell shows whether or not an edge is present. Now, the key punchline to this slide is, so let's think about scalability. Just like with heat maps, if we go all the way down to having 1 pixel per cell, then in the limit, if we had 1,000 by 1,000 pixel screen, we could have, 1,000 across, 1,000 down, and we could actually represent 1,000,000 edges, right, in the limit. And so we can notice how that's a really dense graph, right? That would be a full, we don't have any problems with hairballs. We don't have problems with, edge overlaps or trying to compute edge crossings. Adjacency matrix do not suffer from the hairball problem. So a lot of the problems with node link graphs, we don't see when we have adjacency matrix views. Except, of course, that certain tasks are much, much, much more difficult. And so node-link diagrams are very easy to understand. They're great for path tracing and a lot of topological tasks. People don't typically need to be trained because they're quite intuitive. Now, the good things about an adjacency matrix is, you know, there's you actually you're really focused much more on the edges than on the nodes. And there really is a way to explicitly see for any edge, is it there or not? Whereas sometimes that can be very hard to notice, right? You might have a very short edge and you don't know quite where it is versus a very long edge. So it's very straightforward to lay it out. You do need to compute this reordering, but it's just going to be a matrix, right? There's not a lot of complex computation there. So it's predictable, it's very, very scalable, and you can train people to do some topology tasks. So there's been a lot of energy put into trying to figure out when to use which of these. If your network is small enough, absolutely, just use a node link view. It's the easiest to understand. If you don't need to do path tracing and your network is large and dense, well, then you might consider a matrix view. Some of you might say, but what if your graph is big and dense? But you do, in fact, need to path trace. Well, that's why we have a whole field of what's often called, network visualization or graph drawing, where people think very long and hard about how to come up with layouts that will be understandable. And they're often specifically tuned for particular tasks rather than just trying to solve the completely general problem. Of course, people can do things like, well, why don't we try to have the best of both worlds, right? So here's one system called Nodetrix that said, well, we could try to have, where there's a lot of cluster structure, we could have these little mini adjacency matrices, and then we could have some node link things sort of hanging off around the edges. So we could really have this sort of hybrid view. That's one approach. So we've talked a lot about networks. Let's take a minute to talk about trees. So a fundamental way to draw trees is the same idea of node-link graphs, only we take into account the fact that there's this internal, regularity of structure that we could exploit with trees. So there's some really fundamental algorithms, what's called Rangel-Tilford, of how is it that you can do reasonably compact, and tidy drawings of trees where you really take this parent-child structure into account. And so notice how, in one of these Rangel-Tilford layouts, where actually spatial position is back to being meaningful, right? I told you before with these like force-directed placement, you didn't know what spatial position meant. But notice how we have the root of the tree, and then we have all of the, its direct children at one level, and now all of their children at another level. So actually now in this case, horizontal spatial position really does tell you something about the depth in the tree. It's also trying to be quite smart about being compact. So it's trying to use space cleverly, where it notices when there are and are not things to draw to try to be as compact as possible. For those who are interested, there's a nice write-up on the algorithm. I'm not going to take the time in this lecture to go into depth. But what I want you to notice is that there's sort of variants of this algorithm, and one is rectilinear and one is radial, right? So we could in fact have a radial variant of this, where now instead of going as horizontal spatial position, we're doing something radially, where at the center we have the root, and then we go outward and we lay things out around a circle instead of in a line. And so now we're able to say that the radial depth, right, from the center, and then one ring, another ring, and another ring, so we can still read off how deep in the tree particular leaves are, but it's a radial layout rather than a rectilinear layout. Now there's pros and cons. One nice thing about rectilinear layouts is it's really easy to draw labels in a way that they're actually readable, whereas it's much harder to read text when it's actually laid out at random orientations all the way around instead of just being horizontal and equally readable. So that's one issue there. I'm not going to actually click through, but feel free to have a look in these slides to play around with these. These are both D3 blocks. So let's go back. Let's do our algorithm, our idiom analysis on what's going on with the radial node-link tree, just to give ourselves some more practice in thinking about decomposing things with trees. So, well, of course, our data is a tree. And so what is the visual encoding? Well, it's really, like what we did with node-link graphs, node-link layouts, we again have connection marks that represent links, right? Not quantitative attributes, but links. Um, and these specifically are marks that are acting as connection marks. They are showing that link structure. We can have point marks. Of course, we could leave out the point marks, but often we draw them. In this particular case, we do have this radial orientation rather than a rectilinear one. And so notice how you can tell what are siblings by this sort of combination of spatial position and these connection marks that allow you to follow that. And you can read off the depth in the tree according to the radial distance from the center. So what is this good for? It's certainly very, very usable for understanding topological structure, right? We can very quickly and easily get a sense of, which of these subtrees are large, which of the subtrees are smaller. So understanding topological structure and following paths are both straightforward with this kind of a view. So for the scalability, so if you do want to actually draw labels in order to interpret the meaning of this tree, then maybe you'd be limited to around 1,000 nodes. Again, if this was 1,000 by 1,000 pixels on your display. If you do not need to actually label the nodes, maybe you could get up to 10,000 or so before completely running out of space. A key thing to notice here is that we've gotten away with no edge crossings because we don't have this tricky computational problem that we had with general graphs. So it's much more straightforward and in fact guaranteed to be possible that you could draw trees without any edge crossings. So a lot of these algorithms are guaranteed to avoid edge crossings. They don't just try to minimize them, they guarantee to avoid them. Now there's a very different way to draw a tree than what we've seen before, not a node link way to draw a tree. And what's called the tree map idiom is really, it's using, instead of a connection mark, it's using a containment mark. So we're showing hierarchical structure by putting boxes inside each other. So what we do is our data is a tree, and we're really emphasizing not so much the topological structure of this tree, but an attribute that we have at the leaves of the tree. And so we have a quantitative attribute, and so we're sizing these boxes according to that quantitative attribute. Now, this was actually a tricky structure here. We've got all these interlocking area marks. These are so now we're seeing an interesting case where we are using interlocking area marks, and we have to do this global computation to figure out how we can actually pack all these boxes together so that all the children are enclosed by the parent and then enclosed by the parent in turn. And so we're size coding these, and we have to actually algorithmically compute how these could all fit together, right? We can't just sort of change one without changing a lot of them, because this is the hallmark of the interlocking area marks. So we can see, well, this is definitely rectilinear orientation, right? Not radial. Um, and what is this good for? This is really good for the task of understanding that attribute value that's at the leaf nodes, right? It jumps out at me. Look, here's a big one, and here's a bunch of small ones. So extreme, right? Finding the extreme values, in particular the maximum values. Finding max values is really easy with a tree map. You notice the big things. What's the scale of this? Well, again, just like with all these matrix layouts we've been arguing, in the limit, you could fit certainly no more than 1,000. Sorry, 1,000 by 1,000, i.e. a million. So you could fit up to 1,000,000 leaf nodes in a 1,000 by 1,000 pixel display. So they're highly scalable. What people often use these for is to actually help you find unused, or rather disk space where some huge file is taking up a bunch of your disk. You know, here's one on Mac called Grand Perspective. Here's one on Windows called Sequoia View. And so, you know, you instantly see, oh my God, what is that file? Can I delete that and get a bunch of space back? Or maybe that one, this giant pink thing. So, you know, and here's a somewhat more subtle one where we're seeing these are both using an approach called cushion tree maps that really tries to make this sort of pseudo shaded as if there were a light source to help you see that structure a little bit more clearly. So, you know, one of the big success stories of tree maps has been in disk space viewers. So we've now talked about these two really different ways to draw trees, and let's compare them. You know, one way is that we actually draw the links as connecting lines. And so, you know, in the marks as links, and so when we're, you know, we are showing the links with marks, and, you know, either we can, you know, use these, you know, lines, one-dimensional linear lines. That's really good for emphasizing topology and path tracing. We can use it for both networks and trees. You know, here we see a few examples. And in contrast, here's actually the same data where we're looking at using containment or enclosure or nesting. Um, and you know, there's many variants of tree maps, and they all are using this idea of containment. And they're really good for different things. They're emphasizing this attribute value with the leaves, right? There's a size coding according to the leaf attributes. And so that's really what we're seeing. They're much less good for understanding topology, but they're much, much better for actually understanding these attribute values. And I want you to notice that this only works for trees, because in order to do this idea of enclosing, there can really only be one thing. And you know, there you have to be enclosed by your parent. You're not guaranteed any sort of parent-child relationship with general graphs, but you are with trees. So containment is a reasonable thing to do with tree data. You know, here we've got actually a significantly bigger example where we've even got the highlighting that's the same between these views, and we really start to understand the differences between this topological view of the tree and this tree map view, where we're seeing all of these little leaves enclosed within their, you know, here's these three, and then finally those in turn are enclosed with the root. Well, there's other things we could do as well. Um, so, you know, something I'm going to call implicit layouts is, you know, if we thought about node link views and then tree map views using containment, you could actually communicate parent-child structure in a tree solely through spatial position. So here's a couple variants of that. Sunburst is a radial view, icicle plot is a rectilinear view. And notice how what we're doing with icicle plots, right here is the root. Here is the first level, here's the second level, and so on, and we go down to the leaf level. We're not drawing lines to show that. We're not even enclosing things spatially inside of boxes. We're just using spatial position to actually show those parent-child relationships. So it is certainly possible to do that with trees. So these, what we can think of these as more implicit layouts, whether rectilinear in this case or radial here, where we have, the root and then moving outward. Um, so that's an alternative to either connection or containment marks, just implicitly using spatial position. So notice how with the tree map, only the leaves were sort of directly visible, whereas with these approaches, we're actually able to see all of the inner nodes, right, on these various rows, in addition to the leaves. Now, with the icicle chart, in fact, we can see that not all the leaves are at equal depth. So, we actually have leaves at these multiple depths. But both the inner nodes and the leaves are visible for both of these implicit approaches. So hopefully you've noticed by now, there's a lot of different ways to draw a tree. And what you want to think about from an analysis point of view is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches, right? This is the same data set drawn in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different ways, right? And so what you can think about, is, well, what are these questions that you could ask? You could ask questions like, well, are they all showing the same data? Okay. Um, are they showing link relationships explicitly or implicitly? Are they directly showing the depth in the tree? Is that something you can read off? Um, are they directly showing the order of siblings? In this case, these all are, right? We can sort of traverse along in an order. So all of these are showing, we can understand links, we can understand depth, we can understand sibling order, but how, right? So there's different design choices for showing these, right? One major choice we've talked about quite a bit is connection versus containment link marks, right? A and B and D are all using connection link marks. F and G are using containment. So, right, we've got containment marks in some cases and connection marks in other cases. And when I say containment marks, right, in this case, I mean, this circle is containing this other circle. So, we've got a mark that's showing that parent-child relationship. A bunch of these are rectilinear, and then of course these three here are radial. That's another design choice. Um, are we explicitly using spatial position? And in fact, we are. All of these are using spatial position very specifically. Um, and so, one thing to think about is, which things are redundant. When are we dual coding, right? What we're seeing in this tree is that we're able to see the parent-child relationship redundantly. It's both shown with a connection mark and it's shown with spatial position. Whereas with the icicle plot, we don't have that connection mark. All we have is spatial position. So we're not using multiple channels redundantly here. You know, in what cases are arbitrary choices made versus, do we know why things are in the order they are? Um, it's really worth thinking about information density. So what is the information density of these various layouts? And so a thing to think about is, what if you had to draw the labels? How much room is there available to draw the labels? We can see in this icicle plot, there's a lot of room up here on the root and fewer pixels available to draw labels as we descend in the tree. Whereas in this tree diagram, the amount of room for labels, if we try to fit them inside the nodes, is actually equal. Here it's all equal and it's all small, right? We're not really exploiting space. We just have this tiny little area. If you had a long 20 character label, that would be much too small to be seen. But we'd have a chance of seeing it here because we actually have quite a bit of room to draw labels in. Here, it might be possible to label the leaves, but it's going to be very hard to label any of the inner nodes. So again, we can think, this is sort of an intermediate amount. But in a lot of these, we have relatively little room to draw labels. In only a few could we easily draw the labels. That's how we can think of the information density possibilities of these various layouts. Because we do want to avoid wasting space, and so it's often instructive to think about where we would put labels. So I showed you 8 on the previous slide. Well, here's a website, treeviz.net, that has almost 300 different techniques to draw a tree. It's a great labor of love by Hans-Jörg Schultz. Have a look, treeviz.net, that allows you to just explore this huge number of variations on how it is that you can draw a tree. So, it's been a very active area. People use these for a lot of different, either very specialized and custom or much more general approaches. So there's been a huge amount of work put into this question of how to draw a tree. Many, many, many alternatives out there. So, something you could be thinking about for your final projects is whether or not you want to do some sort of interesting tree drawing for your project, if and only if, of course, that is a reasonable thing to do for the data and tasks that you have. Right, just revisiting this while we're still thinking about trees, because remember, we've now talked about this a few times, the idea that you have your base network and then you derive your cluster hierarchy, and then you can think of drawing that cluster hierarchy explicitly with containment. Now that we've seen containment a bit more, we can actually understand how to analyze that. So what is going on with this visual encoding? You've got your base graph, you've got this cluster hierarchy on top of your base graph, and then you're explicitly drawing. So what are we doing here? The connection marks here are the links in the original network. And the containment marks, right, these larger circles, are showing the hierarchical structure of the cluster hierarchy. So we're using connection for one and containment for the other. And then, of course, the nodes are just point marks. And it's possible with these to have some sort of dynamic interaction where we could actually, click on this to either expand it out or contract it down so that we don't show its, if we contract it, then we're not showing anything inside of it. We're just showing only the meta node and not its internal structure. Here's another example, this idea of edge bundling. Notice how we could even do edge bundling on top of a tree map. So here we are using the base data, uh, we're laying that out with the tree map, and then we're actually showing these edge bundles on top of it. So, earlier we were seeing it with this radial layout. Here we're seeing edge bundling in action with a tree map. So these are both possible. The same basic idea of gathering together the edges works on pretty much any base layout. Okay, so that gets us to the end of this, which was about chapter 9 in the VAD book. And I will say goodbye for now.